All right. Hello, everyone. Sabrina and I, at the last conference, we talked about why we teach classic books, even though they are sometimes kind of problematic or bring up some stuff that we don't always know what to do with as teachers. And so, as we were chatting about what we could do with that, because we had a lot of great follow-up questions, the Q&A, I think Kat said earlier, was almost like a double feature because the Q&A went so long. So we could tell that people were really interested in figuring out how to teach those books. And we sat down and had a conversation about what that looks like. We recorded that conversation because we've learned that if we just try to do it live, we're going to go way over. So this way we could get the pieces that we need and edit it into a nice little box for you. So I'm going to go ahead and play that, and then we'll be available for questions. Do you have anything you want to add to that, Sabrina?
Nope, you covered everything. Thank you.
Right. Well, then I will bring it up. I'm going to double check that this sound is working because sometimes I've had
Mhm.
issues when I'm teaching classes. So I'll play it, make sure the sound's working, and then play it again. So, Kat, if you can tell me if it is going okay.
Hello, everybody. So, Sabrina,
All right. I will let it play then. We'll be back.
I spoke at the last conference about why you should or should not read classics and canonical works. And this conversation kind of grew out of that because a lot of the questions that we got in that great discussion afterwards were about what responsibilities we have if we are tackling any of those texts and what we can do to make them easier for our readers to really understand them and interact with them in a way that does justice to what we're trying to accomplish with them. And so that is why we're here today to talk about putting a book in its place, how to meaningfully contextualize reading. So, when we talk about context, it is helpful to kind of consider what that word means. And in a literary sense, we usually talk about three different terms that are interrelated. Text, which is what is actually on the page. Those are the words that you read, or if you're talking about like a movie, or you can read anything like an artwork. It's what's actually in front of you, what you can see, what we all agree is there. And then subtext is what's not on the page, the meaning that the reader co creates with the author through a process of interpretation. And context is what goes with the text. We have that root prefix there of with. So that those are the elements that are surrounding it, and those elements are different depending on who the author is, who the reader is. Lots of different things change the context of a text when you're reading it, if you were reading it in its own time versus if you're reading it today. And it's that context that helps us kind of make the subtext and turn meaning into what we're doing. So if we can help guide our readers by providing some background for that context, we can make sure that we are reading those more challenging works responsibly.
For this presentation, we decided to each present one work and demonstrate how we can look at different elements of context. And for our purposes today, we chose five elements: the author, the setting, which includes the time and the place, the critical reception of the work, the influence on subsequent works and possibly on genres or other works, and then literary value. And we chose these because we felt like they were accessible and useful elements that can help with engagement at many different types of levels of learning. And also because they help to promote connection across disciplines. They can connect with history, they can connect with science, they can connect with a lot of other types of learning. And that we believe makes it very useful as well as just easy to access.
So we each picked a book. In my case, it's one that I very recently taught in the high school lit class. So I'm teaching a class with classic literature and modern day film adaptations. And one of those books that I taught was The Great Gatsby. So I think this book is an excellent example of how having more context around the book can make you appreciate it more, even if there are obviously some problems with the book and problems with ideas of the canon in general and who is excluded from that and who is included. But I do think that when I provided some context for how this book has come to be part of the canon, such as it is, that my students appreciated it a lot more and that we were able to have some really engaging and interesting conversations. So that's the book that I'm going to be using to apply those elements of context today.
And as a contrast, I'm going to talk about Robert Heinlein's famous book, Starship Troopers. And this is the original book that later inspired a movie that was disowned by his widow. This work has been a very influential and controversial work, and I I always love running towards the controversy to understand why was it such a big deal. And if you know about space battles, space marines, if you or your child plays games like Halo or StarCraft or any games that have space marines in them that are shooting aliens, it probably was inspired by this work. And so I am really excited to teach this work in the spring as part of the spring book clubs. And this is a really great opportunity for us to see how did this work come about? Why was it so important to future works?
So often, one of the easiest places to start when we're providing context for a book is looking at the author's biographical information and just considering who is this author, what made them write this work. I do want to give some warning that I think that we can sometimes lean too heavily on authorial intent and try to read every work through the lens of what was this person trying to say about their own life, when not necessarily every work is about their own life. But in the case of F. Scott Fitzgerald, his own biography definitely informs the work of The Great Gatsby. He was born in 1896, and in some ways he has a bit of a rags to riches story, somewhat like the one that is represented in the text of The Great Gatsby. He also is credited with coining the term jazz age to refer to the 1920s because he was such an influential figure and so kind of involved in that culture at the moment. He rose to fame when he was just 23 after writing a book called This Side of Paradise, and he wrote The Great Gatsby at 30. Both of those were fairly successful, but he struggled shortly after having written Gatsby with alcoholism, and his wife Zelda was struggling with mental illness. He really hit some financial hard times, and he was struggling to complete his novel Tender is the Night. And when it was finally finished in 1934, we were in the throes of the Great Depression. So his work just wasn't seen as very relevant anymore because nobody wanted to read about the jazz age as they were dealing with the Great Depression. So he died pretty much penniless and kind of seen as a has-been, a washed-up author. Nobody at the time would have predicted that he was going to be kind of held up as one of the great American authors. Considered a failure at his death, he later became popular again after he had died during World War II. And I think that's a really interesting story that's part of the context of the book itself. The next way that you can kind of start to pick up on the context is taking a close look at the setting, which is the time and the place of where the book is happening. Sometimes books don't have a realistic setting. Sometimes they're taken out into an imaginary setting. But when they are based in a real world environment, you can often tie in a lot of historical information, whether that is displayed in the book or not, or you're just trying to understand more of the history of the people who were listening to it at the time and what they would have thought of it. So The Great Gatsby is set in Long Island, New York during 1922, though the author of it is actually writing it a few years later. So when it was published in 1925, it would have been contemporary for its readers. This would have been something that someone was looking back on a few years ago. It took place between World War I and World War II at a time that was marked by prosperity for many Americans. It was also a time when America was seeing intense urbanization. A lot of communication was becoming more popular and common. It was an era of change. We also saw prohibition during this time between 1920 and 1933, and that factors into the book. It is a direct relation to some of the content and plot of the book. So that would be something that I could bring in some context. We could read about prohibition, watch some documentaries on it, compare it to laws and discussions that we have today. And so I think that would be a great way to tie this into some historical information. And it was also published just a few years ahead of the 1929 stock market crash and the kickoff of the Great Depression, which definitely is a sharp contrast to the kind of luxury and excess that is featured in this book. The book itself focuses on the jazz age of the 1920s, but it only gives passing nods to the fact that not everyone in the world was drenched in excess and wealth, and that not everyone in the world was white. So you could certainly use this as an opportunity to talk about the diversity of the jazz age and also whose voices are not being considered in this particular telling of that era, even that era in that particular location. New York in the 1920s was certainly a lot more interesting than just these rich people on this island in The Great Gatsby. And you could definitely use this as an opportunity to explore that more deeply. My favorite part of the context for The Great Gatsby is the critical reception of the work. Critics liked The Great Gatsby in its own day, but it did not sell well. It only sold 21,000 copies, which was considered an absolute flop. And looking back on it, even the critics who liked it, they really kind of missed the point. A New York Times article at the time it was published called it a book for the season only and saw it as a kind of a trendy reflection of jazz culture rather than a larger commentary on American values. It wasn't until the 1940s when it became part of a plan to donate 22 million books to US troops who were abroad for World War II. They were sending a bunch of paperbacks to these men who were fighting. The Great Gatsby was one of them. And because of that, it gained this immense popularity and that it was a popular book that was being sold throughout the 1950s, and by the 1960s it had really earned kind of canonical status where people were reading it in schools and analyzing it for its literary value. And so it kind of saw a transformation because of that popularity of that World War II program to get books in the hands of American troops. This is a quote from Christina Hartman talking about the way that our perception of the book changed over time. Gatsby became one of those rare books that gains meaning through distance. Fitzgerald's contemporaries were unable to see the novel for what it was, biting satire of the hypocrisy of the profligate jazz age, because they were in the thick of it. Sometimes zeitgeist works aren't recognized as such until we have sufficient distance in time to appreciate the time period and its cultural significance. And I think this is just a really fun way to open up the idea that what you see in a literary work is not necessarily what was seen when it was published, which also gives us the opportunity to talk about how books of today might be looked at differently in 40 or 50 years, and what will be the cultural touchstones that other people use to reflect on our own current times. And so I think that's one of my favorite reasons to teach this book, is kind of considering that cyclical nature of criticism and reflection and understanding. I also want to talk about its influence on subsequent works. So it had several direct adaptations. Beginning right after it was published, there was a movie adaptation in 1926, another in 1949 and 1974 and 2013. There were TV movies and a TV episode that tried to capture the whole thing in 1955 and 1958 and 2000. So obviously something about this work has drawn people to try to capture it and display it in a way that we can really dig in. But it also has, and this is, I'll just be honest, more interesting to me when it is not just a direct adaptation and it is showing up in the culture in more subtle ways. We definitely see a Gatsby influence in Mad Men. Don Draper certainly has a very Gatsby-ish air to him, both with the rumors about kind of how he got to be who he is and sort of the way that he wears his excess and wealth. The Catcher in the Rye, the protagonist of that book, Holden Caulfield, directly references Gatsby and how much Gatsby's story of wealth and being a self-made man means to him, which is really interesting if you kind of think about the whole the way that Catcher in the Rye has been read and the way that it's been used as kind of a commentary on the American dream. The song Summer Days by Bob Dylan includes several lines directly from the text of Great Gatsby, as does the song Happiness by Taylor Swift. So we see these musicians taking direct lines from the work and bringing them into their songs. Fight Club is a book later turned into a film. It was very popular. That author, Chuck Palahniuk, said he wanted to make an updated version of The Great Gatsby, which I think would be a really interesting discussion on what he thought was Great Gatsby-ish about that and where he sees those connections coming forward. In a similar vein, the 2013 film Spring Breakers has often been compared to The Great Gatsby, even though it's a much more violent and kind of disturbing drug-fueled haze. There are definitely threads. Like you could put those together and kind of see the narrative arcs match up. So you could talk about how this story has found its way into our culture decade after decade after decade, and why. What does that mean? What is it about these themes that continue to resonate? And then finally, this work just has a lot of literary value. It's a great example to teach learners about descriptive language and how we can use it to really draw our readers in and make them pay attention. There's a lot of use of metaphor in the book, very specific metaphors that you can track over time. It's a great one for like, hey, I need you to identify specific metaphors and tell me what they mean. It's a really good work for that. It is also a great work for talking about narrative technique and reliability because it's all told through the eyes of a single narrator who is a first person named character in the story. So we can talk about whether we can trust his version of events and whether he has the full picture. And then it's also just really beautifully written. So we can use it to talk about sentence structure, the aesthetics of language, how do we build sentences that people want to read. And with all of those different elements, I think that this book definitely still holds literary merit and that it gives us a lot to talk about.
All right, so now we'll just shift gears a little bit and talk about Robert Heinlein and Starship Troopers. And what I thought was really fascinating as we look at a bit of the biography of Robert Heinlein, which I took largely from the authorized biography of Robert Heinlein by William H. Patterson Jr., where he gives a lot of really good information about Heinlein's early life. And he was born in 1907, so 11 years after F. Scott Fitzgerald, which I thought was interesting. Also of note, Robert Heinlein is often considered one of the three great fathers of American science fiction, along with Arthur C. Clarke and Isaac Asimov. And Arthur C. Clarke was born in 1917. Isaac Asimov was born in 1920. So Robert Heinlein was born 10 and 13 years respectively before the other two were. And so thinking about that in context is that these three authors became contemporaries in many ways. And so his childhood growing up, he grew up in Missouri in a working class family. And if we look at that time period of being born in 1907, this means that he was a child when World War I happened, and he got to see his brothers go off to serve in the military. Sometimes they volunteered, but there was also military conscription at the time, which plays a really big role in Starship Troopers. He also lived through the 1918 influenza pandemic, also known as the Spanish flu, which I think is a great opportunity for us to think about parallels between his life growing up and our lives and the lives of our learners. And at the time, he read voraciously. Apparently, he borrowed his siblings' library cards so he could check out more books from the library. And he read, for example, the Wizard of Oz books by L. Frank Baum. He read the works of Mark Twain. He and his friends had memorized Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn. He read the works of H.G. Wells, another famous science fiction author. He also read books by Charles Darwin that were based in science, and he also just devoured books and magazines about science and engineering. This was a time when pulp science magazines were coming out. He read stories about Mars, about space flight, about all of these amazing new technologies and how they would fancifully change humanity. And also of note, he grew up in a time when there were no child labor laws. And so by the age of 15, he was actually financially self-sufficient because he worked so many jobs, starting with the 4 a.m. paper route and then moved on to other types of work. And so that helps us to understand what kinds of values, what kind of a society Robert Heinlein grew up in. He wanted to apply to the Naval Academy to follow the tradition of his family, but he actually wasn't allowed to because his brother was already in school there, and they generally had a policy to not allow other sons in the family to join. After strongly petitioning a local senator, he finally was able to gain an appointment to the Naval Academy. And so he went to Annapolis, Maryland, which is where the U.S. Naval Academy still is. And while there, he flourished academically. He ranked fifth in his class just in terms of academics, but he dropped to 20th because he had a lot of demerits. So he was a bit of a troublemaker and an independent thinker as well. Once he went into the Navy, he served under Ernest J. King, who later became the chief of naval operations during World War II. And so he, through his experiences in the military, learned a lot about leadership in times of crisis, in times of service. And unfortunately, he ended up being discharged from the Navy later on because of tuberculosis. But this tuberculosis inspired him with his third wife to actually develop a type of waterbed to help make it easier for him to sleep in. And so his later life ended up being even more interesting, I think. He got politically active. Some believe that he was strongly influenced by his wives. So Leslyn, his second wife, was very strongly politically liberal, and he worked on Upton Sinclair's gubernatorial campaign running for the governor of California. And so we've mentioned Upton Sinclair in the past as the writer of The Jungle, socialist. And so we can see that Robert Heinlein's politics were very left-wing at that time. But then later on, he swung slightly more conservative. He ended up self-identifying as a libertarian politically. But his third wife, Virginia, was actually a fellow engineer. And they were featured in articles in engineering magazines. They designed and built their own home. They designed all sorts of home inventions and devices. And later on in life, a little bit before he died in 1988, he served on the member of the Citizens Advisory Committee on National Space Policy under President Reagan. And so he went through his life starting out as a boy reading all of these books about science fiction, or what would become science fiction, about science and technology, served in the military, and then later in life became active in his society in political and philosophical discussions, and then helped to influence future space and technology policy in the United States. So to shift gears a little bit, we can look at the setting that he created in Starship Troopers. And as a science fiction setting, it's set in the future. There wasn't a specific year put on it. But in this future, there is the Interstellar Terran Federation, which is primarily led by humans. It spans across multiple planets. And in this future, humans have come into conflict with this alien species who are called bugs or arachnids. And we get a few descriptions of them, but there's not a whole lot of exploration about what are these aliens actually like, have we tried to communicate with them and such. We're basically in military conflict. In this society, there is full citizenship, which includes suffrage, the right to vote, as being contingent on fulfilling federal service. And in the book, he explicitly mentions that there is military and non-military service available, but the book itself tends to focus more on the military side of service. And the idea is that you need to be willing to lay down your life or serve your society in order to be considered a full citizen of it. Also of note, gender plays an interesting role in the backdrop of this setting, where the Space Marines are all men, but all the pilots, all the Space Navy pilots basically are women, because in this world, it is acknowledged that women are naturally much better pilots for many reasons. And so therefore, all of them are pilots, while the men are better with the physical use of power armor that all the Space Marines use. And therefore, they are always enlisted in the Marines. And throughout this book, it's interspersed with flashbacks to the main character's high school days, where he talks with his teachers about philosophical and political discussions related to issues of citizenship, moral decline, and service. So in terms of critical reception, this book got the Hugo Award for the best novel in 1960. The book's been translated into 11 languages. And it's considered a central touchstone for works in science fiction and military space fiction. I won't go over all of the different types of critical acclaim that it's received, because critics have been very divided about this. Many said that he glorified the military. Others say that he was critiquing the military and being realistic of it, which brings up the interesting question about, is a portrayal of something in a book the author's advocacy, or is it a critique or exploration? And one review commented on whether this work would actually be able to be adapted to fit a current audience context, that perhaps so much time and so much has changed in society where the meaning would be lost if we were to try to adapt it in a way that audiences today would appreciate. So in terms of influences, there are a huge number of influences on subsequent works. Anything that has to do with militaristic science fiction that was written after Starship Troopers, a lot of non-military based science fiction. Both of these have been heavily influenced by Starship Troopers. Books like Ender's Game, The Forever War, Bill the Galactic Hero, the Confederation series, which we'll do later on in the Spring Book Club as well, are all considered to be responses or critiques or subversions of the world that's presented in Starship Troopers. If you have video game players in your household, if you've played Halo or Mass Effect, Doom, StarCraft, or if you've played Warhammer 40K video games or tabletop, these are all highly influenced by Starship Troopers as well. Basically, anytime you see Space Marines mentioned, it was probably inspired by Starship Troopers. In terms of literary value, there's a lot of really deep political questions about national service and citizenship. As I mentioned, there were questions about whether it glorifies or critiques militarism. Does it support conscription or voluntary enlistment? At the time, conscription was a very big thing, when today we have an all-volunteer military. And so that's where the context could vary. There were also a lot of questions about technology and warfare, how it enhances people, how it dehumanizes us. And finally, there were a lot of discussions about his politics, whether he was reactionary or if he was subversive and progressive. And seeing the gender politics, having women in the military in a time when that was, not a thing, discussing masculinity, toxic masculinity, men as being disposable, macho culture. These were all things that were being discussed in this book before it came into the public consciousness. And what's also notable is that the main character is not revealed in terms of his ethnicity until the very end, where he's revealed as being Filipino, which was pretty significant to have a non-white protagonist. And critics believe that Heinlein did this on purpose to help a mostly white audience to empathize with a Filipino protagonist. So overall, this was a very interesting military story written by somebody who served in the military. And thinking about the politics and philosophy of his time, Heinlein was considered to be almost aggressively progressive in terms of these types of ideas he was trying to bring up and challenge. And so the takeaway I would think about for this book would be, if we were to write a story today, how would we challenge today's norms in similar types of ways? And how would we explore and discuss technology and society in similarly visionary ways as Heinlein did?
Thanks. That was really cool. I learned a lot that I didn't know. I guess what I would wonder is that how have you found students respond to this kind of context work, and how does it work for them?
Oh, that's a tough one.
Just start with an easier one.
I don't know. I'm trying to think. Have you had students who responded well to it?
I definitely have had students who thought that they were going to hate books or were kind of ready to be rigid against them. But then once they had these footholds through context, it definitely opened up the way that they understood the book. And I mean, it doesn't necessarily mean that they will like it or that they forgive it the things that they were holding against it to begin with. Like if you had a problem with there being nothing but white men in the canon, that's still a problem, right? But
yeah,
you can certainly take another perspective to potentially appreciate this specific book while still holding that larger criticism.
Yeah, and so I think I can't quite answer that question because I've been very cautious and I've been trying to think about how can I teach this context in an effective way. And I really appreciate, Michelle, that we've had all these great conversations so I can feel like I have something to work with to try to start broaching this with students. But I completely agree that there is it's great to be able to read a book and just love it, have this emotional, personal connection. But also, I think that by pushing ourselves and putting ourselves in a slightly uncomfortable place where learning can happen and being challenged by things, and giving a framework to understand why was this book about all rich white people, for example, like Great Gatsby, and then to try to understand why did this book have such an impact in the way that it did, and then translate that into what are ways that if we're an aspiring author, we can write a book that would then have impact? Or what are ways that we could drill down into these really big questions that people make a lot of assumptions about and then challenge them the way that Heinlein did, for example. And so I think that that I'm hopeful that that our students will be willing to trust us enough to let themselves go into that slightly uncomfortable place in the hopes of being given some tools to be able to approach not just the current work, but also be able to approach future works that they may encounter.
I really like that you said that thing about trusting us as the teachers, as the educators. And I think that came up in our last conversation too, was that if you approach something with a sufficient amount of context, you can take down some of the reverence for it, right? Like you no longer have to hold it up as like this is this book on a pedestal, and instead you can be like, oh, here are some roads in where I really can start digging in it and get in the mess. Like I know that you couldn't go into too much of the controversy over Starship Troopers for this short discussion that we're having. That would probably be a whole presentation on its own, right? But I definitely think that being able to know that we can get in the weeds of critique and still be doing the work of readers, or maybe even doing the work of readers more than when we're not doing that. I think it's an important lesson for our learners to get to.
Absolutely. And just for a bit of personal context, I picked up Starship Troopers when I was about ready to transition off active duty in the Navy. And so I had been serving in Japan on a ship, and I was done with the active duty and I was going to transfer to the reserves. And it just happened to be at that point, I saw that book at the library and said, oh, I've heard about this. I should probably read it. And so when I read it for the first time, I already had a few years of military service. I'd had to think about leadership. I'd had to think about all of these things. Why am I in the military right now? And so for me, that was a really important touchstone. And it was a chance for me to come to this book with context that I would not have had 5 years prior. And that's something that I can't give all of my students, some years of military service, but I'm hoping that I can be a guide to help them to understand how this book could have meaning for different types of people and how it does connect with a lot of conversations that maybe their grandparents really were thinking about. And maybe by reading an older book like this, that might help them to appreciate what their ancestors or what some of their older family members may have gone through. And I'm hoping that could open up not just more reading opportunities, but just more connection opportunities.
Something that you just said in there made me think of a question that I think might be helpful as kind of a wrap up here, maybe too. When you're picking text, do you start with the context that you want to explore and then go and find texts that fill those gaps? Or do you just pick a text and then work outward and find the context to then give to students? I guess it's kind of a chicken and egg question, right? Like where do you begin when you're trying to figure out what books you should read with learners?
It really depends. Some books, like Wizard's Guide to Defensive Baking, I happened to pick that up randomly and I just tore through it in a couple days and I was cracking up and I said, oh, I've got to share this with my students.
Yes, my daughter and I are reading that one together right now.
Good.
And I love it. Yeah.
It's a hoot. So sometimes there's books like that. I always have the filter of can this be approachable or accessible for a general audience? So nothing too heavy in certain topic areas, like too much romance or things like that. Can it be considered age appropriate, or can it be while still giving some content advisories? For this year, I was trying to pick some books that I felt like would challenge the teen readers, and I love the Confederation series, and then thinking of that, I immediately thought of, oh yeah, maybe I'll do a challenge for myself as well as for the readers and include Starship Troopers to help give them that context. So I had the sci-fi pair, and I thought, well, I do sci-fi and fantasy, so I need to pick a good fantasy pair, and so then that's how I picked the other two fantasy books. So there's some chicken, there's some egging going on, there's some, I don't know, scrambled egging too along the way, and so I try to stay open and try to think about what is something that would bring something valuable in terms of learning for my students, even if it may be a little challenging. But also I know a lot of my students play video games. And so that's a gift that I want to give to them, is to understand, where did all these space marines come from? Well, this is the book that it came from. And it, we have Grandpappy Robert Heinlein to thank for that, for Halo and StarCraft and Mass Effect. And as a video game player, I'm very excited to learn about the influences for my favorite video games. So that was kind of another side reason for why I chose this.
So it's almost like Starship Troopers was the context for that other book, and then so it's like a ripple out effect.
Yeah, exactly. Starship Troopers is the context for Confederation and also for an excuse to talk about video games for me. But what was the reason why you chose Gatsby?
I mean, I had to read The Great Gatsby because I was an English major. And so I have had to read The Great Gatsby for a class, I think 5 times between high school and then undergrad. And then I think I had to read it once in graduate school too. So my own feelings about it changed so dramatically depending on when I read it. Like I hated it at some points and loved it at others. And it continued to have, resonance, and I kept coming up in references. There was someone referred to someone as their Daisy in a way that was supposed to be a compliment, and I was like, oh no, I think maybe you should reread it. Like, I don't know.
Reading the classics sucks all the joy out of your life. Where all of this comes from and why it's problematic.
Like, oh, you're my Daisy. I'm like, no, don't do that. No.
Run, girl, run.
Yes.
I just remember The Green Light because I only had to read it once in high school. But now I kind of want to reread it because of this context that you gave to think about that history.
And I was pairing it with the 2013 film, which has Leonardo DiCaprio in it, and it's such a visually stunning example of like wealth and excess. And Jay-Z did the soundtrack, and so it was just a really, really interesting commentary on the American dream as it exists today, even though they did not change the time setting. Like, it's not like Romeo and Juliet, which was done by the same creator, Baz Luhrmann, reset Romeo and Juliet in what was then modern times in like the 1997 version. And so I kind of expected to see him do that to The Great Gatsby, and I wasn't sure how it was going to work, but he didn't. But it still feels relevant to today. And so I really wanted to revisit it with that in mind, with the way that it had been kind of, because people kept calling it a hip hop version of the film, but it's not, other than the soundtrack, right? Like the soundtrack is the only thing that has like a hip hop veneer to it.
That instantly makes it hip hop.
Yeah.
I'm not a huge film person, but I really appreciate Baz Luhrmann's works, and so I did see the Romeo and Juliet movie that he made, and I really liked that translation. But it sounds like the Great Gatsby movie was able to translate from book to screen, but also translate those ideas of that wealth and indulgence and such to a modern audience, so they get it.
Absolutely. And people who walked away from that movie saying that they hated it, that he ruined the book, I was like, oh, you have not read the book in a while. Because he did not ruin this book. Like, the things that you hate about the movie, those are in the book. So
it sounds like this is going to be our next talk, is about how to judge adaptations.
Yeah, that would be a great one. All right. Well, I think this has been a really interesting conversation. And I guess we can turn it over for questions.
Excellent. Thank you.